At my company's 40th anniversary party on a waterfront estate, my daughter-in-law looked straight at me, smiled, and said, "Charity cases eat last." A few people giggled. My own son saw me standing there and chose to look away. In that moment, I realized his silence hurt more than her words ever could. I quietly set my empty plate down and walked out, gravel crunching under my shoes like it did 40 years ago when my late wife and I broke ground on our first factory. That night, my son texted, "Dad, the business needs your investment." I stared at the screen, then replied, "Never again." One notice went out, and their laughter slowly turned to tears. Thank you for being here. Before we start, if stories about standing up and reclaiming your worth speak to you, please like and subscribe. It helps more people find these lessons. Comment below with where you're listening from. I'd love to know. A quick disclaimer, names and settings have been changed, and some moments are dramatized for impact. But the core truth about self-worth, that's untouchable. Now, let me tell you what happened. The waterfront estate gleamed in the evening light, all manicured lawns and white tents strung with lights that reflected off the water like scattered diamonds. Sterling Manufacturing's 40th anniversary party. My company's 40th anniversary, though you wouldn't know it from where I stood. I'd arrived alone, parking my modest sedan among the luxury cars. The valet gave me a polite nod, the kind you give someone you don't quite recognize, but assume belongs. I suppose I did belong. 40 years ago, I'd signed the incorporation papers with Eleanor by my side. We'd built this company from nothing, but that was 40 years ago. Tonight I was just another face in the crowd. I moved through the guests, past conversations about market projections and quarterly earnings. The air was thick with expensive cologne and catered seafood. Conrad, my son, stood near the bar in a suit that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the past year. He was holding court with a group of investors, his laugh too loud, his gestures too animated. He looked successful, polished. Beside him stood Catherine, his wife, scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency, always looking for the next important person. Her smile was perfect and empty. I moved toward the buffet tables. I'd skipped lunch and I was hungry. The spread was impressive. Shrimp, oysters on ice, carved meats arranged like architecture. I reached for a plate. That's when I heard Catherine's voice, pitched low, but not low enough. "We're so pleased with how the company's evolved," she said to a woman I recognized as a supplier's wife. "It's really Conrad's vision now. Sometimes the older generation doesn't quite understand modern business practices." The woman murmured something polite. I stood there, plate in hand, realizing she was talking about me, the older generation, the one who didn't understand. I was 68 years old. I'd built Sterling from a single workshop into a company that employed 200 people. I'd held patents on machinery that revolutionized assembly line efficiency, and my daughter-in-law was explaining to a guest that I was obsolete. Conrad glanced in my direction. Our eyes met for a moment. He looked away. I set the plate down, empty, and turned toward the exit. No one noticed me leave. Why would they? I was already invisible. The walk to my car felt longer than it should have. Through the estate's windows, I could see the party continuing. Conrad laughing, Catherine networking, the company I'd built, celebrating without me. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been simpler. I was something else, something colder, something that felt like clarity. My shoes crunched on the gravel drive. I'd heard that same sound 40 years ago when Eleanor and I broke ground on our first factory. We'd stood in an empty lot with just a dream and listened to gravel crunch under our feet. Eleanor, God, I missed her. 3 years gone, and I still reached for her in the morning. She would have known what to do tonight. She always did. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, looking back at the lit estate. Then I started the engine. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching under my feet. The same sound I'd heard 40 years ago when Eleanor and I broke ground on our first factory. They didn't know that the foundation they stood on was about to shift. The drive to my apartment took 40 minutes. 40 minutes to think about 40 years. The city lights blurred past my window as I made my way through downtown traffic. My apartment was on the 8th floor of a building that had seen better decades. Small, functional, a one-bedroom with a view of other people's windows. It was nothing like the house Eleanor and I had shared, the house with the workshop in the back, where I'd spent late nights sketching designs while she balanced the books at the kitchen table. But that house was gone now, sold after her passing. Too many rooms, too many memories. I'd met Eleanor at a county fair in the summer of 1976. I was 22, fresh out of engineering school, manning a booth where I was demonstrating a prototype gear system I designed. She was 20, studying accounting, and she'd stopped to watch me explain how the gears reduced friction. Most people's eyes glazed over when I talked about machinery. Hers lit up. "You're going to need someone to help you sell this," she'd said, pointing at my messy notes and hand-drawn diagrams. "You can't market a revolution if no one can read your handwriting." She was right. She was always right. We were married 8 months later. Sterling Manufacturing was born a year after that, in a rented workshop that smelled like motor oil and dreams. I built the machines. She built the business. I could design equipment that would change how factories operated. She could convince people to buy it, manage the cash flow, negotiate with suppliers, and somehow keep us afloat during those early years when we ate ramen for dinner and poured every dollar back into inventory. 40 years we'd built Sterling together, brick by brick, patent by patent, contract by contract. When Conrad was born, Eleanor had brought him to the factory in a carrier, doing payroll with our son sleeping beside her desk. She'd wanted him to understand that success wasn't inherited. It was earned. I thought we'd been teaching him. Now I wonder if he'd been learning something else entirely. 3 years ago, I lost her. Cardiac arrest. She was here one morning, laughing at something on the news, and gone by afternoon. The doctors said it was quick, painless. That was supposed to be a comfort. It wasn't. Eleanor had been more than my wife. She'd been my partner, my anchor, my shield. She'd had a way of managing people, especially Conrad, that I'd never quite mastered. She could be firm without being harsh, could see through excuses without being cruel. When Conrad made mistakes, she'd correct him. When he tried to take shortcuts, she'd redirect him. When Catherine started making suggestions about modernizing the company culture, Eleanor had smiled politely and said no. After she passed, everything shifted. Conrad's shortcuts became bolder. Catherine's suggestions became demands. The board meetings I'd been attending as chairman emeritus suddenly felt like ambushes, with my son and his wife presenting new directions that sounded more like dismantling everything Eleanor and I had built. And I'd let it happen because grief is exhausting, because I thought Conrad would eventually find his way, because without Eleanor, I didn't know how to fight anymore. I pulled into the parking garage beneath my apartment building and sat there in the silence, engine ticking as it cooled. Eleanor had been gone for 3 years. In that time, my son had become someone I no longer recognized. Or maybe he'd always been this way, and she'd just been good at shielding me from the truth. Either way, the shield was gone now. 7 years ago, my son nearly brought down everything Eleanor and I had built. So, I did what I'd always done. I fixed it silently. I sat in my apartment that night, letting myself remember the crisis. I'd retired 10 years earlier, stepping back to let Conrad take over as chief executive. Eleanor had reservations. Conrad had always been more interested in appearing successful than doing the work. But we'd wanted to believe responsibility would mature him. We were wrong. Within 3 years, Conrad had over-leveraged the company for a downtown headquarters. Not because we needed it, but Conrad wanted glass and steel, corner offices, a building that screamed success. He'd financed it with loans against company assets, assuming growth would continue. It didn't. Conrad was good at smoozing clients, terrible at operations. Orders slipped, delivery time stretched. Our 40-year reputation began to crack. The banks called before Conrad admitted there was a problem. Our accountant reached out. "Richard, you need to see these numbers. We're 3 months from insolvency." Eleanor was still healthy then, still sharp. When I showed her the balance sheet, her face went pale. "He's going to lose everything," she whispered. I couldn't let that happen, not while she was alive to see it. I called Kenneth Morgan, an attorney I'd worked with on patent filings. Discreet, trustworthy, the kind of man who understood that sometimes business happens in the shadows. "I need to create an investment vehicle," I told him, "something anonymous." Cornerstone Equity Group was born in Kenneth's office over a week, a limited liability company with Kenneth as managing partner. On paper, he was the face. In reality, my proxy. I liquidated investments Eleanor and I had built over decades. Retirement money, $6.5 million. I wired it to Cornerstone, and Kenneth approached Conrad. Capital injection for 45% equity. Conrad didn't ask questions. He should have. Any competent CEO would want to know who was behind that kind of money, but Conrad was too relieved, too desperate, and probably too arrogant. The deal closed in 2 weeks. Sterling was saved. Conrad threw himself a party. I attended, watching him speech about strategic restructuring and securing institutional investment. He accepted congratulations from board members who'd wanted to oust him weeks earlier. He never mentioned the near collapse. In his version, he'd seized an opportunity. Eleanor squeezed my hand during his speech. She knew. "You saved him," she whispered. "I saved us," I corrected. But I'd saved him too, and he never knew it. For 7 years, I'd been the silent partner in my own company, 45% owner, largest shareholder after Conrad's 30%. But Conrad ran Sterling as if it were entirely his, making decisions without consulting the anonymous investors, spending money like it was his personal account. Kenneth sent quarterly reports. I watched from a distance. After Eleanor passed, I told myself I was giving Conrad room to grow. Really, I was just too tired and too broken to fight. But tonight, sitting in my apartment after being dismissed as obsolete, I understood something clearly. Silence wasn't patience. It was power. And I'd been silent long enough. The humiliation didn't begin at the party. It began 3 days earlier in the house where I'd been living with my son and his wife. I'd moved in 6 months after Eleanor's passing, not because I couldn't afford my own place, but because Conrad and Catherine had insisted. "Dad, you shouldn't be alone," Conrad had said. "Tucker would love having his grandfather around." I'd believed him. That was my first mistake. The house was large, modern, expensive, everything chosen to project success. I'd taken the guest room on the 2nd floor. After 40 years with Eleanor, everything that mattered fit in 2 suitcases. The morning it happened, I came downstairs for coffee just after 7. The sun was barely up. Catherine was waiting in the living room, not reading, not having breakfast, just waiting. She'd positioned herself deliberately near the stairs. "Richard," she said, not Dad. "We need to talk." I set down my mug. "All right?" She didn't sit. Neither did I. "This isn't working," she said, her voice steady, almost businesslike. "Having you here, Conrad and I have discussed it, and we think it's time you found your own place." She continued before I could respond, words coming faster, like she'd memorized them. You're making our guests uncomfortable. We entertain clients here, Richard, important people. And frankly, having you shuffle around talking about the old days, it doesn't project the image we need. This is a young company now, a modern company. She paused, then delivered the line she'd been rehearsing. Your time is over. This is Conrad's era. Each word landed like a blow, not because of what she was saying, but how she was saying it. Like I was furniture that no longer matched the decor. I heard footsteps. Conrad appeared from the hallway, still in his robe, coffee in hand. Our eyes met. He looked away. He said nothing. My son stood there in his expensive house, bought with money I'd helped secure, and said absolutely nothing while his wife told me I was no longer welcome. On the stairs, partially hidden, I caught sight of Tucker, 11 years old. He was supposed to be getting ready for school, but he'd heard everything. He was watching, his face tight, uncomfortable. When I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw guilt. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds. Then Catherine noticed. Tucker, go finish getting ready. He disappeared. I turned back to Conrad. Conrad? He wouldn't meet my eyes. I think it's probably for the best, Dad. New chapter for everyone. I nodded slowly. There was nothing left to say. No argument that would change this. No appeal to loyalty or family or 40 years of sacrifice. This was who they were. This was who my son had become. I'll pack my things, I said quietly. It didn't take long. 2 suitcases. 40 years reduced to 2 bags. I walked out through the front door, got into my car, and drove away. Conrad stood in the doorway, watching, still silent. I found a small apartment downtown that afternoon, 8th floor, 1 bedroom, a place where no one would tell me my time was over. 3 days later, I'd attend the anniversary party one last time. And that night, when my son reached out asking for help, he'd finally learn what it meant to ask the wrong person. Later that evening, back in my small apartment, I poured a glass of water and sat in the quiet. That's when my phone buzzed. It was Conrad. Not a call, a text. Dad, we need to talk. Quarterly numbers came in short. Need a bridge loan. $30,000 to smooth things over with the bank. Family helps family. I stared at the screen. $30,000. 3 days ago, his wife had told me my time was over. That morning, I'd packed 2 suitcases and left. Tonight, at my own company's party, I'd been dismissed as obsolete. And now, Conrad wanted $30,000 because family helps family. The audacity was breathtaking. He had no idea the anonymous investor his company owed $16.2 million to was sitting in a 1-bedroom apartment reading a text that asked for pocket change by comparison. I set the phone down and walked to the window. Somewhere out there, Conrad was probably congratulating himself on solving a problem. Reach out to Dad. He always helps. He was right. I always had. But there's a concept in banking called good money after bad. You don't keep lending to someone who's proven they can't pay you back. You don't keep investing in failure. The bank of tolerance was empty. I'd been making deposits for 68 years. Patience, silence, swallowed pride. I'd never received a single payment in return. It was time to foreclose. I picked up my phone, but I didn't call Conrad. I called Kenneth Morgan. He answered on the second ring. Richard, I was wondering if I'd hear from you tonight. It's time, I said. The buyout clause. Yes, you're sure? I thought about Eleanor, about Conrad's fancy suit, and Catherine's cold eyes, and Tucker, watching from the stairs. I've never been more sure. I'll draft it tonight. 40 minutes later, the email appeared. To Conrad Bennett, CEO, Sterling Manufacturing, from Cornerstone Equity Group, Managing Partner, Article 4, Section B. Dear Mr. Bennett, Cornerstone Equity Group is hereby exercising its right to full liquidity of its 45% equity stake in Sterling Manufacturing. Per the shareholder agreement executed 7 years ago, the company has 45 days to provide fair market valuation in cash, currently assessed at $16.2 million. Should the company be unable to provide said liquidity, the forced sale clause will be triggered and the company will be sold to the highest bidder. Deadline, 45 days from receipt of this notice. Regards, Kenneth Morgan, Managing Partner, Cornerstone Equity Group. I read it twice, then I hit send. The swoosh was the quietest sound in the room, but I knew it would land like a corporate guillotine. I sat in the silence of my apartment. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., this email would arrive in Conrad's inbox. He'd open it over coffee, probably still congratulating himself for reaching out to his reliable father, and then he'd understand what it meant to ask the wrong person for help. 45 days, that's all the time I'd given him. It was 44 days more than he'd given me. For 45 days, I watched my son scramble for money he would never find. For 45 days, he called me asking for help, unaware he was calling the wrong person. At 9 a.m. the next morning, a notice from Cornerstone Equity Group landed in Conrad's inbox. I know because Kenneth called me 15 minutes later. He's already tried to reach you 3 times, Kenneth said. I'll answer when I'm ready. An hour later, Conrad called again. I let it ring twice before picking up. Dad. His voice was tight. Did you see this? Some investor is calling in their stake. They're demanding $16.2 million in 45 days, or they'll force a sale of the entire company. I saw it. This is insane. I don't even know who these people are. Cornerstone Equity. He snorted. I need to figure out how to handle this. I was hoping maybe you could... I can't help you with that, Conrad. There was silence. Then what? I said, I can't help you. But Dad, this is the company. Our company. If we lose this. 45 days, I said quietly. That should be enough time to figure something out. Then I hung up. During the first week, Conrad went to the banks. I knew because Kenneth kept me informed. The credit lines Conrad had used to fund his lifestyle were suddenly frozen. News of the forced sale clause had spread. No bank wanted exposure to a company that might not exist in 6 weeks. In the second week, Conrad chased new investors. But investors ask questions. They inspect books. They want to know why an existing shareholder would trigger a forced sale. The deeper they looked, the faster they lost interest. By the third week, Conrad called me 5 times. I answered twice. Each time, I gave the same response. I can't help you with that. In the fourth week, his voice finally cracked. Dad, please, I don't know what to do. The board is panicking. Catherine is. He stopped, then whispered, Please, I'm asking you. You asked me for $30,000, I said, 3 days after your wife told me my time was over. Did you think I forgot? That was different, he said. This is about the company, about our legacy. No, Conrad, this is about accountability. I hung up again. Weeks 5 and 6 blurred together. Conrad tried everything. He called former clients, past board members, and business associates I had introduced him to decades earlier. No one wanted to invest in a company led by a man who had already over-leveraged it to the edge of collapse. Kenneth sent updates every few days. They're scrambling, he said. Catherine is calling everyone she knows. Conrad is selling personal assets. It won't be enough. He was right. The math was unforgiving. They needed $16.2 million. Even if Conrad liquidated everything, the house, the cars, his personal stock, he might reach $3 million, maybe 4. It wasn't enough, not even close. I didn't feel satisfaction watching him struggle. I didn't feel cruel. What I felt was colder, heavier, something that resembled justice. On day 45, the deadline passed. Kenneth called that evening. It's done. They couldn't raise the funds. The forced sale clause has been triggered. Good. I've scheduled a meeting for the day after tomorrow, 10 a.m. at our office. Conrad and Catherine will finally meet the investor. I'll be there. Richard, Kenneth said carefully, are you sure about this? I thought of Eleanor. 68 years. I've never been more certain. On day 46, Conrad received another email. A meeting had been scheduled at Cornerstone Equity's office. At last, he would meet the anonymous investor. At last, he would understand. Before I reveal what happened in that boardroom, I need to know you're still with me. If you've made it this far, type the number 68 in the comments. Richard's age. Let me see it. And a quick note. What comes next includes some dramatized elements for storytelling. If that bothers you, you can stop here. For everyone else, let's go inside. I arrived at the Cornerstone Equity Group offices at 9:50 in the morning, 10 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. 38th floor, glass walls, city views, and a conference room where my son and daughter-in-law were already waiting. They didn't know they were staring at their own future. I adjusted my tie and walked toward the conference room. Through the glass, I could see Conrad pacing near the window, phone in hand. Catherine sat at the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. They looked like people waiting for a verdict. In a way, they were. I opened the door. Conrad turned. His face went blank for a moment, then twisted into confusion. Dad. His voice cracked slightly. What are you doing here? I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. I walked to the head of the table and pulled out the chair. I'm exactly where I need to be, I said. Catherine's eyes narrowed. This is a private meeting. We're waiting for the investor. I finished. I sat down slowly, folding my hands on the table. I know. Conrad blinked. Dad, this isn't. 7 years ago, I said, cutting him off. Sterling Manufacturing was on the brink of collapse. He froze. You were over-leveraged. The banks were circling. You had 90 days before they called the loans. I kept my voice even, businesslike. You told me you'd secured emergency funding. A private equity firm, anonymous, $6.5 million. Conrad's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I leaned forward slightly. You raised that capital from me. The silence that followed was profound. Catherine's expression shifted from confusion to calculation. Conrad looked like he'd been struck. That's not possible, he whispered. It's not only possible, I said. It's documented. Cornerstone Equity Group, formed in Kenneth Morgan's office. I liquidated retirement accounts, stock portfolios, bonds, everything Eleanor and I had spent 40 years building. $6.5 million wired through this company in exchange for 45% equity in Sterling Manufacturing. Conrad's face had gone pale. You're Cornerstone? I am Cornerstone, I confirmed. I saved you anonymously because I knew that if you found out the money came from me, you'd never respect it. You'd see it as charity, as interference. So, I let you believe you'd earned it. Catherine's voice was sharp. Why are you telling us this now? I met her eyes. Because 45 days ago, you asked me for $30,000, a bridge loan. Family helps family, you said. I let the words hang in the air. I decided it was time you understood what family actually meant. Conrad sank into a chair. He looked like a man trying to solve an equation that kept shifting. His father, the man he'd dismissed, the man Catherine had evicted, the man he treated like a burden, owned nearly half of everything he thought was his. I don't understand, he said quietly. If you saved us 7 years ago, why? Why this? Why now, I stood. The light from the window caught the edge of the table, sharp and cold. Because, I said. I wasn't finished talking. I saw comprehension begin to dawn on Conrad's face, slow like sunrise, through fog. He was starting to realize that this meeting wasn't about the past. It was about what came next. But there was still one more thing they needed to hear. I pushed a folder across the mahogany table. There's a second matter we need to discuss, I said. Conrad's eyes followed it. Catherine leaned forward, slightly guarded. Over the past 45 days, Kenneth conducted a forensic audit of Sterling Manufacturing's finances. I opened the folder, revealing highlighted ledgers, expense reports, and wire transfers. What we found was exactly what I expected. Color drained from Conrad's face. Misappropriation of funds, I said. $280,000 in unauthorized expenses over 5 years. Luxury travel billed to the company. Vehicles leased under corporate accounts. Country club memberships. Conference fees for events never attended. Dad, Conrad's voice broke. We can explain. Explanations don't change numbers. I turned the page. Then there's Catherine's salary. Chief Brand Officer. $150,000 a year for 3 years. $450,000 total. I looked at her. For a role that produced no deliverables, no campaigns, no measurable value. Catherine's jaw tightened. She said nothing. And finally, I continued, $180,000 in personal expenses run through Sterling's accounts, home renovations, private school tuition for Tucker, vacations, all coded as business costs. I closed the folder. Total misappropriation, approximately $910,000. The silence was absolute. Conrad's hands trembled. Dad, please, if you give us time, we can. The buyer requires a clawback clause, I said. Standard in cases of financial misconduct. Misappropriated funds must be repaid before any equity distributions. I let it settle. Your 30% stake is valued at roughly $5.4 million, after fees, costs, and the clawback. I paused. Your net payout is zero. Zero. Catherine snapped. Zero. I confirmed. You'll sign over equity. The debt is settled. No criminal charges, no public scandal, but no money. Conrad's face collapsed. Dad, you can't. Catherine will. He stopped. He didn't need to finish. I reached into my jacket and removed 2 corporate credit cards retrieved from accounting that morning. One bore Conrad's name, one bore Catherine's. I placed them on the table. Then I took the scissors Kenneth had left in the folder. I cut Conrad's card first. The sound was sharp, final, then Catherine's. The halves fell between them. You have nothing left, I said quietly. No money, no company, no cards. This meeting is over. I stood and buttoned my jacket. Conrad dropped his head into his hands. His shoulders shook. I couldn't tell if it was anger, grief, or the realization that everything he built rested on my foundation, and I had removed it. Catherine sat perfectly still, staring at the cut cards. Her expression was cold, calculating. She wasn't thinking about Conrad. She was already planning her exit. I felt no triumph, no rush of victory, only the quiet certainty that consequences had finally arrived. This was not revenge, and it was not cruelty. It was the inevitable outcome of choices made in private, justified in whispers, and ignored for years. What remained in that room was not punishment, but the bill coming due, long, overdue, and impossible to escape for everyone involved, those who believed themselves untouchable. I walked to the door. Goodbye, Conrad, I said. I didn't wait for an answer. I stepped into the hallway as the door clicked shut. The elevator waited. I pressed the ground floor button and watched the numbers descend. I left them in that conference room. Conrad broken, Catherine calculating, 2 shredded cards between them. I didn't look back when the doors closed. I didn't need to. 3 days later, the deal closed. At 9 a.m. in the morning, my phone buzzed with a notification. The wire transfer had arrived. $14.7 million. I stared at the number for a long time. It had never been about the money. It never was. It was about standing up when you've been pushed down, about enforcing accountability when you've been dismissed, about knowing at 68 years old that your value isn't determined by the people who've forgotten it. The money was simply proof that I'd been right all along. George Patterson called me that afternoon. I'd finally told him the truth the day before, about Cornerstone, about the 45 days, about the meeting. He'd been silent for a full minute. Then he'd laughed. "You old fox," he said. "All this time you own the whole damn thing." "Not the whole thing," I corrected. "Just enough." "Enough to matter," he said. "That's all you ever needed. I used part of the money to buy a house, not a mansion, not a waterfront estate with gravel driveways and glass walls, a quiet place in the suburbs, with a front porch, a modest garden, and enough space to finally breathe. Eleanor would have loved it. A week after I moved in, a letter arrived, Conrad's handwriting on the envelope. I sat on the porch and opened it slowly. It was an apology, long, rambling, full of explanations and justifications and promises to do better. He wrote about Catherine leaving, just as I'd predicted. He wrote about Tucker asking questions. He wrote about how he hadn't understood, but now he did. I read it once, then I folded it, placed it in a drawer, and didn't reply. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some apologies come too late, and some lessons are only learned in silence. I thought about Tucker often. The boy had been there that morning when Catherine told me to leave. He'd watched from the stairs with wide, uncertain eyes. I hoped he'd be okay. I hoped someday he'd understand that loyalty and love aren't the same as blind obedience, that standing up for someone isn't weakness, it's the hardest kind of strength. Maybe he'd learn that. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility anymore. That evening, I sat on the front porch as the sun set. The sky turned gold and amber, the colors Eleanor had always loved. I could almost feel her beside me, shaking her head with that knowing smile. "You waited too long," she'd have said. She'd have been right. But I'd finally done it. I'd reclaimed what was mine. Not the money, not the company, but something far more valuable. My dignity, my sense of self, the knowledge that I didn't have to accept crumbs from people who'd taken everything. I went inside and made a simple dinner. Nothing fancy, just a meal I cooked with my own hands, in my own kitchen, in a home I'd chosen for myself. I sat at the table and took the first bite. And for the first time in 3 years, the food didn't taste like charity. It didn't taste like obligation or guilt or the need to be grateful for whatever I was given. It tasted like freedom. At 68, I'd learned the most important lesson of my life. It's never too late to stand up, never too late to enforce boundaries, never too late to walk away from people who've made you feel small. I wasn't the charity case anymore. I wasn't the man eating last, grateful for scraps. I was eating first, and that made all the difference. Looking back on this journey, on everything I went through, I realized that Grandpa's stories, like mine, aren't meant to inspire revenge. They're meant to remind you that it's never too late to remember your worth. Don't be like me. Don't wait until you're 68 and sitting in a small apartment, dismissed by the people you sacrificed everything for. Don't let years pass while you convince yourself that staying silent is the same as keeping the peace. God doesn't call us to shrink ourselves to make others comfortable. He calls us to stand in our truth, even when it's hard. The lessons I learned came at a cost. I learned that boundaries aren't cruelty, they're self-respect. I learned that accountability isn't vengeance, it's justice. And I learned that sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who need to learn what happens when they take us for granted. But here's what I wish I'd known earlier. God sees you. Even when your family doesn't, even when you're eating less, feeling invisible, wondering if anyone notices your sacrifices, He sees. And He doesn't measure your value by how much others appreciate you. Your worth was settled long before anyone dismissed it. So, if you're watching this and you see yourself in my story, if you're the one always giving, always accommodating, always grateful for scraps, let this be your sign. Stand up. Speak up. These are the grandpa stories we need to hear more often. Stories about finding your voice before it's too late. Grandpa stories like these are meant to be shared. They're lessons written in the margins of long lives. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell me what lesson hit home. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to this channel because with God's grace, everyone deserves to know it's never too late to reclaim your dignity. Thank you for following this journey to the very end.